Doris Beckner with the Bartholomew County Public Library. And as many of you know, March is Women's History Month. So we thought it'd be a great idea to bring together two of the county's best book lovers to chat about books by women authors. So we have Beth Stroh, owner of Viewpoint Books, and Jodi Prather, a librarian here at our library, who just is an excellent, both of them, excellent lovers of books. But before we begin, I want to talk to you just a little bit about the community book read for this year, which is The Year We Left Home by Thompson, also a female author. Beginning in Iowa in about 1973, this book follows a farm family through the many changes affecting American life during that time period. A lot of us can remember that time period. The characters in the novel search for fulfillment and happiness in an ever-changing, often alienating country. The story asks us to consider the enduring, uniting power of place, why we choose or are forced to leave, and when we decide to come home. Copies of The Year We Left Home, for you to read, pass on to a friend, or read and bring back to the library, will be available April 5th. We also have several events related to the community book read, and those will take place later in the month. Those will be listed in our April program guide, or you can view them now at our events calendar at mybcpl.org. We also have some related children's books that will also be available April 5th for you to read, bring back, or pass on to a friend. And now, Beth and Jodi share some of their favorite books by female authors. Have a good day.
You would think as a bookstore owner that I read many, many books every year. And you are correct in thinking that every single book that I order for our customers in the store is on my to-be-read list. Unfortunately, that's thousands of titles every year, and I can't read them all, especially because 2020 was such an odd year, and I didn't have much time to read anything other than orders and all the other stuff that we needed to do that was non-book reading. I set a goal in 2021 to read more books, and I'm happy to share with you today some books by women that I have found particularly fun, interesting, awareness building, educational, and some of them I can even look forward to books to come. So I was fortunate enough to read the first ones in the series. I'm going to start with fiction, and the first book is one of those books that I'm fairly certain, because of the way that it ends and the author's notes, will become the first in a series about not only written by a woman, but about a lead female character. The Jigsaw Man just came out. It's a new title. It's also a debut novel by Nadine Matheson. Nadine was born in London. She still lives there, and she is a criminal solicitor, which means she's a criminal attorney in the British law system. This debut novel is about a character, Detective Inspector Angelica Henley. And as I say, it's the first in the series of police procedurals. So if you like those kinds of stories, I think you're going to love this one. It's crime fiction that's actually set in the author's neighborhood. She wanted to focus on the unique characteristics, the diversity, and the beauty of her neighborhood. And it's not one that's been featured in any other novels up to this point, even though many novels are set in London. There's really, really strong character development. That's one of the unique things that I appreciated, especially about a debut novelist in this book. So even the unlikable characters are ones that you feel are fully fleshed out, and you can, if not understand or empathize with them, you at least feel like you know those characters. Angelica, the lead character, put a gentleman by the nickname of the Jigsaw Man in prison through her investigation, but only after he wounded her quite seriously. And she was on desk duty for a while. She's now back, actively working a case that appears to be a copycat. This book has a lot of the characteristics, if you're familiar with Silence of the Lambs, has a lot of that kind of feel where there's a woman investigator, this really evil character who seems to take great joy in killing people and does it repeatedly as a serial killer. Themes in this book, there's, as I said, with well-developed characters, then you can really begin to get inside the relationships of the characters as well as into the thinking of the characters. That is absolutely true in this book. It deals with the challenges of being working parents and especially working moms. Angelica is a mother, and she's in a very difficult line of business, if you will, and she struggles with and discusses, not always in a very friendly way with her partner, the implications of her choosing to return to work and return to the work of investigations rather than being in an office. That puts her in jeopardy, and she understands that, but she's also compelled to continue her work. There are racial justice and injustice issues in this book. It's not a key theme in the book, but Nadine is a Black woman in London, and so is Angelica. As I say, it's not the guiding theme of the book, but it is certainly present, and you begin to understand how Angelica has felt as a Black woman in her position. There are stereotypes, and it causes you to think why you have an impression of people in certain circumstances, and so it leads you to understand some of those people a little bit better. There's trauma, PTSD, all kinds of very thoughtful and compelling ways that the author addresses the implications of those circumstances. And as I said, juggling work and parenting was a large theme in the story, and seems particularly relevant given the last year and more that so many parents have tried to juggle work with their family and their responsibilities to their children, children who were home from school, no matter what their age, and how you manage all of that. So it's very timely, very taut, very scary. And I'll share with you the review that I wrote about that, because I don't normally choose scary books. So no, I don't read books that scare me, yet I could not put The Jigsaw Man down, even when my reading time is in the dark of night, when I am most likely to be terrified by a real-life crime thriller. Ms. Matheson, who is a newcomer to the literary community, uses her experience as a criminal defense attorney and her abundant talent to draw us into the compelling story of Detective Inspector Angelica Henley and her nemesis, convicted serial killer Peter Olivier. When victims reassemble body parts, mimicking Olivier's method as the jigsaw killer, start reappearing throughout southeastern London, even while he is serving a life sentence in a maximum security prison, Henley and her team must find the copycat, all while trying to balance difficult work and home lives. Compelling you to read on in spite of your best instincts for emotional well-being or a sound night's sleep, The Jigsaw Man is well worth a little less of both. It ends in a cliffhanger too, so be watching for the next book from Matheson. We have this book at Viewpoint. I imagine you can also get it from the library. It's a really good fiction. A second book that I've read recently, and on a very different note, I don't have a copy of it yet because it releases in May, on May 11th, We do have it on order, so you can pre-order at Viewpoint Books if you're interested in this. It's written by Jessica Anya Blau. The title again is Mary Jane. The author was born in Boston. She grew up in Southern California, and you can see evidence of both her birthplace and where she grew up in the characters and in the story that she's written. She is a prolific writer. This is not her first book. She's written short stories, essays, even movie scripts. And her debut novel was another one that was another coming-of-age story. And she seems to have a common theme of that experience in many of her books. The debut was The Summer of Naked Swim Parties. She also wrote Drinking Close to Home, The Wonder Bread Summer, and The Trouble with Lexi. So this is her fifth novel. It's perfect for summer fun, for a light read that you will probably laugh out loud while you're reading, but it's also a thought-provoking and very worthy book for you to spend time with. In it, Mary Jane is a 14-year-old girl, so coming of age, that challenging time of early teen years. She is doing that in the midst of the 70s. And I was a young person in the 70s, so I could appreciate and relate very much to the character of Mary Jane, who was a nice composite of many people that I knew and reflected other family circumstances too that I was aware of. Mary Jane is an only child of conservative parents who live a very traditional life, but she's hired as a nanny for what would be considered a family of hippies, partners who have a young daughter who's also their only child. And he is a psychiatrist who takes on a client, and only one client through the summer, who is in recovery. He is a musician, well known to the world, and trying to overcome his addictions. His wife is also a musician and an actress, and so anywhere they go, they are easily recognized, and they come to live with the doctor and his family as a way to undergo some private therapy, or at least be in a more private place where they might not be recognized as easily and where they can focus on his recovery. So a very different home life than what she experiences during the day as a caregiver, nanny, mother's helper in this family of people where she works. Mary Jane is very open-minded. She is very aware of the differences between her home family and the family that she's working for. And she loves both, and she finds value in both, and she straddles both worlds amazingly well, which makes her a very attractive character to me. Hers is the only voice throughout the entire book, and here's the review that I wrote of Mary Jane, just to give you a sense of how much I appreciated it. Jessica Anya Blau makes me proud to admit I was a teenager who found her way through the 70s. Mary Jane, the lead character and sole narrator of Blau's new novel by the same name, is a wonderful fusion of many girls I knew during our turbulent coming-of-age days. She is also a perfect example of how open-minded people, especially teens, can nimbly straddle very different worlds without judgment, finding value, meaning, and joy in both. Sharing delightfully humorous to deeply moving experiences with her strict parents and the hippies for whom she works as a summer nanny, Mary Jane emerges as a strong, independent, thoughtful, and ultimately, though not at the beginning, confident young woman who understands better than some adults that each of us has far more capacity to love and be loved than we might imagine. I love Mary Jane, the book and the person, and am overjoyed to have found them both in this gem of a novel. Again, Mary Jane comes out in May 11th, and we are taking pre-orders at Viewpoint Books if you would like to read it. I want to switch to some nonfiction, again by women, more contemporary. One is a couple years old, the other one just came out, and I think maybe one of the reasons that I was driven to these two books, not just because they were written by women, but because they also share the experiences of women and during different time frames. So the first one is Furious Hours. Furious Hours came out in hardcover, and we have signed copies of it, and I'll tell you the story behind that in just a minute. But Furious Hours is murder, fraud, and the last trial of Harper Lee. The author is Casey Sepp, and we do have just a few, as I said, signed first editions of this book, which came out a couple of years ago. Casey, the author, was born and raised on the eastern shore of Maryland, and she still lives there. I learned through the COVID-19 pandemic during 2020 that her mother is actually a postal carrier for the United States Postal Service. She was delighted because her mother got to bring her the copies of her first version, or what we call the advanced reader copies of Casey's very own book, and delivered him to her home. She also, her mother played an integral part in helping to get mail delivered during COVID when it was so essential. And Casey actually did a story about the challenges to the Postal Service during 2020 when they were understaffed, when they were taking great risk, and she was able to personalize that very much because she knew someone who was in that circumstance. I also thought it was interesting that when she wrote her book, she dedicated it to her mother and father. She said, "For my father and my mother, who gave me a pocket watch, then taught me to tell time and everything else." So she clearly is a person who recognizes and values family. And anytime that that's the case, it also rings very true to me. And I appreciate her writing. She is a graduate of Harvard, and she studied at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. So she's a very intelligent person. She's a staff writer for The New Yorker. This is her first book, and it became an instant bestseller, so reflective of her talent. She recently wrote a couple of articles for The New Yorker. One is a Marilynne Robinson profile, and if you don't know, Marilynne's books in a series that she wrote were just selected by Oprah Winfrey for her next book read. And then she wrote about indie bookstores, independent bookstores like Viewpoint all across the country, and the challenges and opportunities that we've seen throughout the COVID experience, and particularly in trying to compete with online booksellers. So I appreciate Casey for her talent and writing of this book, and as a person that I feel like I know, and there's a little more about that to come too. The book itself is written in 3 sections. The first section is about Reverend Willie Maxwell, who was a preacher in the South, in the area near where Harper Lee was born and raised. And he was a serial killer who was using life insurance policies that he took out on family members, and then they suddenly died. And he was charged only once with one of those murders, And an attorney by the name of Tom Radney was able to convince the jury that the minister was not guilty. The interesting part is, and the second part of this book is the story of Tom Radney. Tom Radney goes on to defend the nephew of Reverend Willie Maxwell, who is so frustrated by the fact that the Reverend keeps killing people, but keeps getting away with it and getting paid their life insurance policies, that he confronts him at a funeral in the calling area, and he kills the minister. He kills Willie Maxwell. The same attorney, Tom Radney, then defends him on one of the very earliest cases of not guilty by reason of insanity. And it's a successful case, even though all these people witnessed the shooting. So Willie Maxwell, the preacher, getting all of this insurance money, killing people and not being convicted of that. Tom Radney is the attorney who not only represents him, but his killer successfully. And then there's Harper Lee. And what does Harper Lee have to do with all of this? Well, Harper Lee became very interested in the story of Willie Maxwell and made several return trips, talked to Tom Radney, the attorney, and started collecting notes, expecting to write a book about this story as her second or sophomore book, not a novel like To Kill a Mockingbird, but a true crime story. And she felt she had the experience to do that because she had helped her friend Truman Capote with the book In Cold Blood. In Cold Blood, you may know, is a true story, but written by Capote in a more lyrical fashion as the story of killings that took place in the Midwest. So Harper Lee had helped Truman Capote gather that. In fact, many of the people related to that story did not want to talk to Truman Capote. They found him to be odd, to be arrogant, and so it was Harper Lee who could go talk to people, interview them, collect all of that, organize that material into notes, and she was actually the backbone behind In Cold Blood. So she felt she had the experience to write the story of Willie Maxwell and the people associated with his serial killing. She never did write that book. Because of family responsibilities and other issues, didn't accomplish that goal. And as you know, never wrote another book. And so this book explains and really draws together the emerging history of insurance and life insurance, which interested me because my father worked for a life insurance company, of the law and changes in the law, which also interested me because I have many family members who are in the law in a variety of different ways. And Harper Lee, who has always been one of the women that I most admired, specifically because of To Kill a Mockingbird, which I've had a chance to read, obviously, and teach to many students throughout the years. So I found this to be a compelling, very readable, very relatable book by Casey, and I wrote a review of it and submitted it to the American Booksellers Association for consideration of this book in our Indie Next, which means books that independent bookstores want to promote. And my review of Casey's book was accepted and printed in our national publication. She consequently then sent treats to all of the staff at Viewpoint and has continued over the years, a couple of years now, to send us occasional notes, to follow us on social media, and to promote Viewpoint as a bookstore and a place that people should visit. So that's the personal connection that I really appreciate too, that came about when you read a good book and you comment on a good book, and then you can take it to heart and remember it for a long time. Here's what I wrote about this book. In Cold Blood and To Kill a Mockingbird kept me up reading all night as a teen. Add Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and The Last Trial of Harper Lee to the list of couldn't put it down tomes. I was enthralled, educated, and awestruck by Casey Sepp's well-researched and masterfully written true crime account of an Alabama minister and the lawyer who defended both him and his killer, who sought justice that the courts wouldn't deliver. Intrigued by the saga unfolding so close to her hometown and in search of material for her next book, Harper Lee followed the case, keeping the same meticulous notes she took for Truman Capote as he drafted in Cold Blood. Thankfully, Sepp discovered and brought to light what surely would have been Harper Lee's second bestseller. And then I needed a good night's sleep. This was one that kept me up for different reasons than the others I've described. Another nonfiction book just came out. We have this one in the store as well. We had a customer who came in for it before we received it, and so I have the finished copy of the book. I gave her the advanced reader copy because she so wanted to read it, and it was such a good book. The fourth book that I'd like to talk about is Come Fly With Me, written by Julia Cook. Julia lives in Vermont. She is a journalist, travel writer, editor, and teacher, and this is her second book. The first book was The Other Side of Paradise, about young Cubans and how they negotiate individual desires and ambitions within culture, history, and politics. And she focused specifically on women. As you can imagine, Come Fly the World does, she focuses on women, those who were the stewardesses, the first, and that's what they were called then, not flight attendants, on Pan Am. She went to an event. Her father worked for Pan Am, and she was invited to an historical society event at the TWA terminal at JFK, which was designed by Eero Saarinen. And she met two stewardesses that were in their 70s at that event and decided that telling their story would be a uniquely interesting and untold story to that time. She took 6 years to do the research, to gather interviews with the stewardesses and more, to talk with them about their experience. And I want to share with you just from the inside cover of the book. In a Mad Men era of commercial flight, Pan Am World Airways attracted young women who wanted out and wanted up. Required to have a college education, speak 2 languages, and possess the political savvy of a foreign service officer, a jet-age stewardess serving on iconic Pan Am between 1966 and 1975 also had to be between 5 feet 3 inches and 5 feet 9 inches, between 105 and 140 pounds, under 26 years of age at the time of hire, and single. So what Julia Cook is able to do is to weave together the story of these young women who chose to become stewardesses with Pan Am, but who also had aspirations beyond stewardessing, beyond being in that field, whether those be career aspirations, whether they wanted relationships and marriage and children, which they weren't allowed to have. And they served during some of the most urgent and dynamic political times. and in some of those markets. So Pan Am flew to Vietnam, flew service people to Vietnam and out of Vietnam. They were part of rescuing many of the people that needed to escape Vietnam in the last days of U.S. presence there. There were other things that happened all across the world that these stewardesses witnessed or were part of as the United States started to really look at globalizing its air travel, at attracting visitors to the United States, and they were on the front line of doing that work in a job that probably not many of us thought entailed all of that. So this was highly informative, again, because she weaves in the stories of the stewardesses themselves and their experiences. It's very readable and very relatable. So this is a very current nonfiction book, the fourth of the ones that I've recommended written by a woman, and something that I would encourage all of you to take a look at as we celebrate women during the month of March. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Jodi Prather and I'm with the Adult Circulation Department at Bartholomew County Public Library. And I'm here today to share with you some of my favorite recent reads by women authors. And when I first started thinking about this project, probably the first book that I came across was a book called Bookish Broads. And of course I had to pick that up because of the title. This is Bookish Broads, Women Who Wrote Themselves into History, and it's by Lauren Marino. And what this does is it's a nifty little volume that gives little short summaries about 50 plus authors, and all the way from the 11th century to present day. J.K. Rowling is in here, Margaret Atwood is in here, and it talks a lot about how they started writing, their greatest achievements, and most interesting, I think, is all of the obstacles that they faced in becoming writers, a lot of which were mainly due to the fact that they were women. Many were self-educated all the way up into the 20th century, and this book is best summed up by the author herself when she states that it's meant to celebrate a selection of women who took up their pens and who were compelled to express themselves and comment on what they saw as flaws in society or on frustrations in their own lives that might resonate with other women. It's filled with interesting information and inspiring quotes, and I think the commonality between all of these authors was best expressed by Octavia Butler when she stated, "I began writing about power because I had so little." This is a great book to pick up if you are just looking to find a new author to read, or if you want to enjoy the artwork in its pages, because each author features a portrait. This is Aphrodite, and there's lots of really neat authors in here. There's little interludes about different subjects. That's Kate Chopin and Rachel Carson. So I really would recommend that you take a look at Bookish Broads by Lauren Marino, especially if you're a bookish broad like me. Well, when I was reading that great book, I found out something that I didn't know before, and the fact that the first novel ever written, generally considered the first novel ever written, was written by a woman. And her name was Lady Murasaki, and it was written in the 11th century, and it was called The Tale of Genji. I had to go find it after I learned about it. It details the life and romantic exploits of Genji, the son of the emperor. It's filled with politics and romance and intrigue, and if you're a fan of those kind of novels that talk about palace misbehavior and court antics, and you really feel like you want to sink your teeth into a classic, then this might just be the novel for you. It's over 1,100 pages, I'll have to warn you. So this is a continuing project for me, but I can tell you already that it's incredibly interesting. It was my first exposure to medieval Japan, and I'm very glad I learned about it in the Bookish Broads book. I'm a big fan of historical fiction, and whether it be Japan or the United States, I like to read it a lot of different from a lot of different time periods. That brings me to the next book that I want to show you, and it's called The Children's Blizzard, and it's by Melanie Benjamin. Now, a lot of you might recognize that name if you've read her book, The Aviator's Wife, The Girls in the Picture. She's written quite a number of titles. The Swans of Fifth Avenue. I picked this one up because it was about children, and I have a fondness for books about children. She's an experienced author, and she handles this subject with great grace. And if you're not familiar with this actual event, this was based on a true story of a storm that struck the prairie in January of 1888. And she tells this story from numerous points of view, but mainly from two sisters, Gerda and Raina. And of all the storylines in the book, the storyline of these two sisters was the one that really touched my heart, because these two sisters were teachers. They were sent to be teachers on the prairie. They were a little more than children themselves. And on that day that the blizzard struck in 1888, they each made different decisions that affected their lives. That day that the blizzard struck was really, really warm. It was in January, but it was so warm outside and so sunny that the kids they all went to school without their usual gear. You know, can you imagine sending your child off without their mittens or their scarf, or maybe a light coat instead of their heavy winter coat? That's what happened that day that the blizzard struck. And we're going to pick it up. I'm going to read you a little part of this book with Raina, and as her student Annette sees her. Teacher, too, looked shaken. She stared out the window at the blackness, the electric sparks. Even the little stove in the middle of the room was giving off eerie flares. What was it that was so crushing that made Annette want to clamp her hand over her ears and fall to the floor? It was a blizzard for sure, but every one of them had seen prairie blizzards. Every one of them had witnessed the furies of prairie weather, the tornadoes in the spring, the fires, even grasshoppers forming living clouds and marching across the land, eating everything in their path. Floods when all the year's rain fell at one time and when all the snow melted. But this was different, and Annette couldn't begin to figure out why. She only knew that the furious cloud that had now completely blotted out the sun and was pummeling the schoolhouse until the boards creaked and the windows rattled seemed to have overtaken her heart too, and made her want to howl with terror. She was shivering, but it wasn't only from the fear. The temperature had plummeted. Teacher shooed them all away from the window toward the stove, but it didn't seem much warmer there. Go put on your cloaks, children. They shuffled into the cloakroom, even colder there, and hurriedly bundled themselves up before rushing back to the stove. Annette looked around. Hardly any of them had worn their usual winter layers. Heavy cloaks and coats and wool stockings and petticoats, knit hats, mittens, scarves. Only one or two children were adequately dressed. The rest of them, like Annette herself, had gleefully left most of the layers behind this morning because it was so warm. It had been so warm. So that was Raina, and what she had decided was to hold her children at school when she saw that the storm was coming. Now, her sister Gerda kind of went a different path. Children, make a run for it, she called out as she quickly doused the fire in the round-bellied stove with a pail of water. You'd better hurry, it looks like a big one. It was the right thing to do, she decided. They were already bundled up and ready to go home, and she'd officially declared school out. There would be no teaching her disappointed pupils if she changed her mind and kept them inside. Go home, Gerda called gaily over the whine of the wind that was causing some of the students to halt in confusion. They looked at her, questions in their eyes. Homestead children understood weather. Shelter in place, wasn't that what they were taught to do in a blizzard? But they were also taught to always obey the teacher. So that's what happens when Gerda and Raina, two teachers at two different schools, send their kids. One decides to keep her children there. The other decides to send them on their way home in the middle of a blizzard. And this story is so heartbreaking, and it's riveting to read, because even though you know bad things are going on, bad things are going to happen, you can't stop reading it. The author writes about the cold in a way that, you know, you can feel it in your bones when you're reading it. And she's created some truly memorable characters. And that's the Children's Blizzard, and it was named the Children's Blizzard because of the time that it struck. The worst time of all, right when all of those kids got out from school. And you got to remember, this was a time before weather forecasting, and so it was totally unexpected. It's a powerful read, and one I would really recommend. Now, if we go to another era in historical fiction, we can look at a book called The Kitchen Front by Jennifer Ryan. And this book tells the story of 4 women during World War II who are competing in a cooking competition sponsored by the BBC to determine a new host for their cooking show that they have, whose goal is to teach wives and mothers how to make nutritious meals with war rations. And throughout the story, there are recipes interspersed, although I have to admit, these recipes really give truth to the saying, making something out of nothing, and there are very few of those that I would be willing to try. But if you are looking for how to make the best whale meat steak, then one of these recipes might be right up your alley. This book is inspiring. It's a heartwarming story. It's a story of how these 4 women come together. They work together. They learned how to find value in each other, even though they're all 4 so different. It's an ode to the resilience of women and a testament to good old-fashioned girl power. It's a reminder, too, and it's an important thing. One of the reasons I really like historical fiction is that it teaches a lot of history in good stories, and it's a reminder that history is not only about the guys, that there are plenty of women that were serving behind the front lines, that were showing incredible courage and incredible strength. Jennifer Ryan, in an interview I read from her, has stated that she can't write a book with an unhappy ending, and I, for one, am glad, because if you like to read historical fiction like I do, you know that happy endings are kind of few and far between. I'm glad she's giving us some. You probably know her from if you read the Chilbury Ladies Choir. This book is like a big comforting bowl of stew. So pick up The Kitchen Front if you want a nice comforting read. Now to kind of change pace a little bit, and we're going to talk about another historical fiction. This was my favorite read this year so far, and I know we're only in March, but I read a lot, and this one has so impressed me, and it's called The Yellow Wife, and it's by Sadika Johnson. Now, the Sadika Johnson has written other books, but I think this is her first foray into historical fiction, and she really knocks it out of the park. It tells the story of Phoebe Dolores Brown. She's a 17-year-old plantation slave when we first meet her. She's the daughter of a slave and the plantation owner. Her mom is the healer and on the plantation, and Phoebe, because of who her father is, has been raised with privileges not afforded to most slaves. She reads, she writes, she plays music, and has understood from a young age that when she turns 18, her father is going to grant her freedom. Well, a lot of circumstances intervene, some awful things happen, and Phoebe finds herself in a slave jail. It's a slave jail called Devil's Half Acre, and the name pretty much says it all. She's in this slave jail, and she garners the attention of the jailer himself, who makes her his concubine. She suffers atrocities at his hands. She lives with him as his wife. She bears his children. And I mean, there's just a lot in this book, a lot that happens to Phoebe that is just is beyond explanation. It's hard to talk about because it's just so intense. It's a hard book to read, but it's also, I think, a valuable story because it speaks so much to the courage and the resilience and the strength of this young woman and her overwhelming desire to make a life for herself and her children. And it's a testament to the strength of motherhood because the things that she endures for the sake of her kids are just incredible. This book was based on a true story. It was based on the life of Mary Lumpkin, who was also the enslaved concubine wife of the real jailer of Devil's Half Acre in Virginia. It's a powerful story and a worthwhile read. And like I said, it's my favorite one I've read this year so far. It's called The Yellow Wife. Okay, I've got one more historical fiction to share with you before we switch gears. And this one is for those of you who might like more of a darker tale, a suspenseful thriller type, and it's called In the Garden of Spite, a novel of the Black Widow of LaPorte. And yes, I'm talking about LaPorte, Indiana. This is the novelization of the life of Belle Gunness, otherwise known as the Black Widow of LaPorte. And she's accused of killing as many as 14 people over the course of her life, mostly men, some children. But one thing that this book points out and that is so chilling is when it starts with her life in Norway when she's a teenager and she suffers an attack by a neighbor, and she becomes pregnant, and she goes back to the neighbor who and to try to get him to marry her, but he beats her and she miscarries, and then she flees to the United States, and she flees to the United States bitter and enraged and determined never to let a man stand in her way. She's determined never to suffer from poverty. She's determined to never feel powerless ever again. And that's what she pretty much endeavors to bring about. Her skills at manipulation, the author are just incredible. I mean, the author gets right inside her head, and to learn her motivations as she is committing these awful murders is kind of mesmerizing and chilling. I couldn't put it down just because I was just captivated by this woman. She was so bitter, and this garden of spite that she sows, I mean, is something I'll never forget. This is an example of a trend that's coming up, I think, in literature, all about feminist fantasies, feminist rage. This is definitely a book about feminine rage that is hard to forget, hard to put down. It's a big book, but it moves along at a fast clip because you just can't believe what you're reading. And to know that this is a novelization of a true person even adds to the terror. If you like true crime, this is a fictional true crime story, and it's called In the Garden of Spite by Camilla Bruce. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about a couple of different kind of books. The first one is called The Blue Ticket, and we talked about Belle Gunness trying to find power and going about it through rage and murder. Power lies at the heart of these next two novels, but kind of in a different, but the story is told in a way different manner. The Blue Ticket by Sophie Mcintosh. Now, if you've not read Sophie Mcintosh before, you're in for a treat. This is her second book. It's a follow-up to The Water Cure, which was also a great read. She's a fantastic writer. Her passages are lyrical. Her descriptions create scenes that are just seared into your mind. She does more with fewer sentences than many authors I've read. And this story follows Kala, a young girl waiting for her first period. And when the time finally arrives, she finds herself at the doctor's office eager to learn the course of her life, because this is where everything changes. We lined up, waiting to pull our tickets from the machine, the way you would take your number at the butcher's counter. The music popular that year played from speakers on the ceiling. Just gravity enough, just ceremony enough, not necessarily such an important thing after all. My name was called first. They watched me as I walked the length of the room towards the machine inside its cloaked box. I put my hand in it. I was apprehensive, but ready for my life to be decided. I closed my eyes and thought about my father. The machine was silent as it discharged a sliver of hard paper into my hand. It was deep cobalt. "Congratulations," the doctor in the dark suit said to me. Well, the other girls followed, each taking their own ticket from the machine in turn. "Almost a full house," he exclaimed at the end, reading a piece of paper spat out from the machine. We huddled and compared tickets. They were all blue except for one, which was white. The girl with the white ticket was escorted into a separate room by the doctor and another emissary. We watched the three of them walk through an unlit doorway, and when the doctor came back, he clapped his hands twice. "You have been spared," he said, with a terrible benevolence. So Calla has drawn a blue ticket. She is not motherly and will not be allowed to have a child. This is what society has told her. And at first that's okay. A childless existence to Calla means more freedom, more fun, more work, and a life of few consequences and more possessions. So when Calla decides to become pregnant, she's given two options. You can terminate the pregnancy or run for the border. We'll give you a 12-hour head start. Calla decides to run for it, and on the way she meets other women, both blue ticket holders and white ticket holders. White ticket holders being the ones that have been deemed motherly and are going to be forced to have children. And the thing that all of these women that she meets have in common is that they're all rebelling against a society that has made this choice for them. And this is a fascinating book. It's a fascinating story about freedom, and will resonate with anyone, I think, and make you think about what you value most. Well, The Women's War by Jenna Glass is the first book in a fantasy trilogy. This is a fierce fantasy. This is a fierce feminist fantasy that paints a world controlled by men where they have all the power and women are nothing but pawns, tools to get what they want. Until one day, a woman managed to set loose a spell in the world that grants women the power to determine whether they can become pregnant. And the whole society changes. Society itself must change, and the women must learn how to use their newfound power and stand up for themselves. And this comes after generation upon generation of enslavement, rape culture, that have left the women in this world unsure of themselves and weak. And while the world building is fascinating, and it's fascinating to see how this one thing changes their whole society, it's the characters in this book that really are inspiring. Watching these women all find their voices, all find their strength and their power will make you want to stand up and cheer. When I read this book, the sequels weren't out yet, and this second sequel is now out, and the third will be out this summer. So I'm really eager to read what happens next. And if you like high fantasy, but more of a character-driven one, this is The Women's War, and I would certainly recommend it. By Jenna Glass. Now, the last book that I want to share with you today was my favorite book from last year, and it's called Betty, and it's by Tiffany McDaniel. And I love this book. It makes me smile to read it, to even talk about it. It was my favorite read of 2020, and you will not find a more emotionally intense and beautifully written coming-of-age story, I don't think. It takes place in Appalachia during the 1960s, And it's a love letter to that region, even as it addresses some of the most powerful challenges facing that region, such as sexism, racism, and remember this occurs in the 60s, abuse, suicide, and poverty. It's a fictionalized account of the author's own life, which no doubt accounts for how deeply personal it is. The relationships are finely drawn and the drama never lets up. Here's a taste of Miss McDaniel's writing, and I hope it inspires you to pick up this novel, because I really love this book, and it's a fine novel, and I hope you pick it up and you get drawn into the time and place just as thoroughly as I was. This is Betty. A girl comes of age against the knife. She must learn to bear its blade, to be cut, to bleed, to scar over, and still somehow be beautiful and with good enough knees to take the sponge to the kitchen floor every Saturday. You're either lost or you're found. These truths can argue one another for an infinity. And what is infinity but a tangled square? A cracked circle, a space of fuchsia sky. If we bring it down to earth, infinity is a series of rolling hills, a countryside in Ohio where all the tall grass snakes know how angels lose their wings. I remember the fierce love and devotion as much as I remember the violence. And when I close my eyes, I see the lime green clover that grew around our barn in the spring while wild dogs drove away our patience and our tenderness. Times will never be the same, so we give time another beautiful name until it's easier to carry as we go on remembering where it is we've come from. Where I came from was a family of 8 children. More than one of us would die in the prize-winning years of youth. Some blamed God for taking too few, others accused the devil of leaving too many. Between God and devil, our family tree grew with rotten roots, broken branches, and fungus on the leaves. It grows bitter and gnarled, Dad would say of the large pin oak in our backyard, because it doubts the light. That's just a small sample of the writing in this book. It's a great book if you're interested in the relationship between fathers and daughters. It's a wonderful novel, Betty, by Tiffany McDaniel. And that's all I have today. Thanks for listening. I featured just a few of the novels that are available at the library, written by women authors. There are tons more. There are books in the romance genre that I did not talk about today. There are books in the teen department, books in the juvenile section, all by fantastic women authors who are sharing their voices with all the young girls, all the teens, all the women in our county that, they're just waiting there for you. And if you didn't see any of these novels that you might like, give me a call at the library and we'll talk about some more, because we've got so many here, so many great works of literature that are just waiting for you. If you want to email me, you can email me at jprather@mybcpl.org, or you can look for me at the circulation desk. There are plenty of novels here waiting at the library, and I look forward to talking to you soon about finding the best one for you. Thanks.